Welcome back to Train Signal's VMware Vsphere 5 training. You're watching Installing vCenter 5 lesson. So this is going to be an awesome lesson. We're going to do some cool things in this lesson. So we're going to go very quickly through the slides here. We're going to take care of some of the main things that you need to know and all that good stuff. And then we're going to dive in and install Virtual Center. So we're going to start off by talking about, well, what is Virtual Center? What is vCenter? Why do you need it? What does it do exactly? Then we're going to look at the vServer or vCenter server blueprint. What are the different components that make up vCenter? We're going to talk a little bit about, well, should you do vCenter server physical or should you keep it virtual? What are some of the pros and cons, and what is the approach? What is my personal opinion, etc. We're going to talk about the Virtual Center or the vCenter server features. What are the different components that tie into vCenter exactly? We're going to look at the hardware and software requirements to install vCenter. So before you install vCenter, you got to know what you need. The database requirements, the port requirements, and then we're going to talk about, well, how do you evaluate Virtual Center? Where do you get it from? And so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and get started. What is vCenter? vCenter in essence is very simple. It is a centralized management application. It is a framework that serves as a proxy for managing ESXi hosts and their virtual machines. So think of it in very simple terms. It's a centralized management console server application that you can use to manage your ESXi hosts, to manage your clusters, to manage your data centers, and to manage your virtual machines. vCenter is a requirement for enterprise features. For example, if you want to do vMotion, storage vMotion, high availability, storage DRS, so storage distributed resource scheduler, that's also features. All of those are features of vCenter. VMware Update Manager, all of these you will need Virtual Center in order to be able to complete them. So what makes up Virtual Center? What are the blueprints of Virtual Center? And for those of you that are going to sit and take the VCP exam, these are some of the slides that you probably want to pay close attention to and understand how VMware categorizes vCenter from a component standpoint. So you have your core services. This includes your VM provisioning, your task scheduler, your event logging, a host and VM configuration, so on and so forth. Then you have your distributed services, features like vMotion, HA, DRS. Think of those as, they're not third-party add-ons, but they're sort of like add-ons. They don't make up the core of what vCenter is all about. These are the extended features of vCenter. Then you have your additional features, plugins like Update Manager, vShield Zones, Orchestrator, Data Recovery, Storage Monitoring, so on and so forth. You have your database interface. How will I interconnect? How will vCenter save its configuration, save its file? The APIs sort of that allow it to connect to Oracle or to a SQL database. That's known as the database connector or connectivity. You have ESXi host management. That's another interface, so to speak, or another API to interface with the ESXi hosts themselves to manage them. You have your Active Directory integration, again, another API, another set of plugins within Virtual Center that extend its features and capabilities. And then you have your standard vSphere APIs, your software development kits or SDKs for developers to be able to write these applications that can plug into vCenter and extend its features and capabilities and functionality. One good example of the SDK, back in the 3.5 and 3.0 versions, a lot of people wrote, for example, the ability to GUIfy, so to speak, storage vMotion. So storage vMotion was available, but it was only available through command line. And a lot of developers in the community developed these GUI interfaces that plugged right into the vCenter and extended its capabilities so that you can do storage vMotion from a GUI before VMware introduced it. So that's what you use the software development kit for. vCenter server physical or virtual? Now, let me ask you this question. If you believe in virtualization and you're about to deploy this great enterprise class virtual platform after you've watched David and I's CBT here, the DVD training, and you're going to become an expert on virtualization. So you're willing to trust all your enterprise class applications to the virtual environment, but you're not willing to trust the management console to the virtual environment? So before I go through what's on the list, you're probably reading them, let's talk a little bit. So Virtual Center on its own is meaningless, right? So even if Virtual Center goes down, the environment isn't affected. So if you lose Virtual Center completely, the environment isn't affected. However, there's an inconvenience. You have to log into every ESXi host itself. but the environment will stay up and running. So if you build the environment properly, if you take the proper necessary precautionary measures to safeguard vCenter, then by all means it should be virtual. Why would you add another physical machine that's running a Windows application with Virtual Center on it as your management host? There is a lot of benefits to Virtual Center being virtual. First, you don't need another physical device in your environment. VMware will recommends VMware's best practices, or VMware leans more towards having vCenter as a virtual machine. You don't need to dedicate hardware to it. As a virtual machine, it can be very easily backed up. You don't waste an entire server on Virtual Center. Virtual Center can participate in HA, so you can vMotion Virtual Center around if a particular host where vCenter is pinned to goes down. HA will automatically power it on a different server. Now, the other thing to consider here, and when we talk about, well, how do I build vCenter? There's a lot of services, right? So you can use the vCenter heartbeat services to make sure you have a secondary vCenter. You can always have a secondary vCenter if you want powered down, or you can restore it very quickly from a backup if vCenter itself is the problem. You can cluster it. You can do all sorts of things with it. But here's what I recommend for vCenter if you're going to do it as a virtual machine, right? So make it into a virtual machine. And in environments where you have 20, 30, 40, hundreds of ESX hosts, it becomes difficult if the environment goes down or if vCenter goes down to figure out which ESXi host vCenter is on. You would have to log into each one of them manually to reboot it or power it on. So what you do is you create an affinity rule. And you create that affinity rule within Virtual Center to say that I want my Virtual Center virtual machine to only exist on 3 of the hosts in my cluster. So if you have a cluster that's 10 or 20, select 3 hosts and make sure that vCenter can only exist on one of those 3 hosts. So it still participates in HA, still participates in DRS, it's still taking advantage of everything, except it's not going through all of the ESXi hosts, it's pinned to one of those 3 hosts. So when it's vMotions, it's one of those 3. If it goes down, you're going to log into one of those 3, you're going to find vCenter, and you're going to bring it up very quickly. Some of the advantages of having it as a physical server is it's not at risk of the vSphere outages. Now, I have seen an environment, it's come to my attention that there could be circumstances where vCenter is at the mercy of the vSphere environment. So what happened in the environment that I'm talking about is the cluster was unstable due to the blades that were being used and the HBAs that were being used. There was a lot of contention on the I/O ports. vCenter, being a virtual machine, was suffering some of the outages that the rest of the cluster was having. But this was an entire ESX cluster of 15 or 20 servers that was affected. The whole environment was affected. The SAN was affected. There was a lot at stake here. vCenter was the least of our concerns, but it did make it difficult because every time we wanted to manage anything, we had to log into these servers individually. If we wanted to find Virtual Center, we had to go looking for it. Now, we pinned Virtual Center to 3 ESX hosts. Obviously, after we figured the problem, everything was good and dandy. But there are circumstances where vCenter, being a VM, if it's not configured properly, can become a bottleneck. However, for 99.9% of the environments that I've seen and that I've built, I recommend vCenter to be a virtual machine. And if you wanted to take extra precautionary measures, make sure you set up the Virtual Center heartbeat services to another Virtual Center so that if you lose the primary, you have the secondary one in place and ready to go. So by all means, there should be no reason why Virtual Center you should waste your resources on Virtual Center being a physical machine. All right, so pre-installation requirements. What do we need to have? Well, vCenter needs to be part of a domain. You need to have a static IP address and host name assigned to it, DNS, all that good stuff. You have to create the backend database, so if it's SQL, Oracle, whatever the case might be, you want to make sure that you have a database ready. You want to make sure you determine your licensing options, so you want to have your license keys and all of that. Even though when you install vCenter, as we're going to do in a second here, we're going to go through the evaluation license, but you want to make sure you license it properly as well. You want to make sure you're setting the correct time and date on the Virtual Center server. Your servers must be registered in DNS. That's just good practice at this point. You have to be able to resolve them from all of your ESXi hosts. Good practice that should be followed. Best practice also dictates that vCenter should not be on a domain controller, so make sure you don't have that. And you need to have an account that you're using to install a vCenter that has the following rights. You want to have it a member of the administrators group so that you avoid any kind of headaches, act as part of the operating system, and log on as a service. That way you're able to complete the installation successfully. All right, the vCenter features. So what makes up the different features of vCenter, right? So you have vCenter in the middle here that is at the heart of everything. Then you have your ESXi management. You have your access control for Active Directory. You have your templates that you can use using vCenter to deploy multiple machines from a single image. You have your converter that allows you to P2V or virtual machines or import them from different virtual infrastructures. You have the VM management. You have update managers. Those are some of the main features that make up Virtual Center that you should be aware of. All right, hardware and software requirements. What are we going to need from a hardware and software perspective? We are installing Virtual Center as part of a virtual machine during our demonstration, but I've listed here for you guys the hardware and software requirements. I've taken this immediately out of the vCenter 5 admin guide. So before you take the exam, and depending on what the update level of vSphere 5 is when you're taking the exam, make sure you double check these just so that they're up to date, just in case update 1 or update 2 modifies any of these settings and you get quizzed on in the exam. I would always double check these, and also double check them before you go and start installing Virtual Center in production as well, just to make sure you're covered. Database requirements. I've also listed some of the supported databases here. The default database, you can also use Microsoft Server, SQL Server 2008 R2 Express. That comes as part of the installation. If you have a small or you're building a demo or test lab, you can most certainly use that, but these are also the requirements that you'd need from a database perspective. Now, once we install Virtual Center, within Virtual Center there is a database space calculator, and I'll show you where it's at. It's a built-in database space calculator that allows you to estimate what is the average, or what is going to be the space required from a database perspective. So once you have Virtual Center up and running, we're going to go in together and say, okay, well, my Virtual Center is going to have 10 ESX hosts, 500 VMs. What am I estimating my space requirements from a database perspective? You can either go allocate that space, or you can tell your database administrator what you're going to need, and they will allocate that space accordingly. I will show you where that's at as well. Port requirements. Again, if you're taking the VCP 5 exam, these are ports that you want to know, you want to understand, you want to memorize. I'll almost guarantee there will be some questions around what the different ports are from a basic default standpoint, from an installation standpoint. Unless there's a specific requirement or need why those have to be changed, I would leave those at defaults. Make note of any changes you make here if you are about to change them within the GUI. All right, and finally, if you want to evaluate Virtual Center 5, if you want to follow along and download an eval version, I've also listed the website VMware.com where you can go here, try VMware, and go and download a 60-day evaluation of a Virtual Center that you can use to also follow along in our training DVD, so that you can also execute the same tasks that we are doing. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and start installing vCenter 5. So we've logged into our vCenter server. I've added the server to the domain. I've given it a static IP address. I've made sure it's registered in DNS. So I've done all the prerequisites that we talked about in the presentation. I've also copied the installation files for vCenter onto the desktop here for easier access. So what we're going to do is, if we open up the folder here, I want to run the auto run command, the executable auto run. This will show us the splash screen for the installation of vCenter. Once you've, it's very, it's changed a little bit, but one of the things that I like here is if you select vCenter, it'll tell you some of the prerequisites that you'll need to make sure that you have those installed prior to installing a vCenter, and it'll do that for every one of the packages that are available here. So I kind of find that handy. So if you select vCenter and you're ready to install it, you've met all the prerequisites, click on Install, and the wizard will take you through the installation. You'll notice that the installation is pretty straightforward. There's not much in the form of configuration at this point that you would have to do. So the cool thing here is, if you haven't installed or configured the Microsoft.NET framework, the installation wizard is smart enough to do that for you. It'll go in and install the particular role within Microsoft as Windows 2008 R2 operating system is what I'm using. So it'll go in there and enable that particular role and all of its prerequisites for you, so you don't have to do anything. So they've really done a really nice job with this installation wizard. Once you're ready, or once the wizard is ready, you can click on Next to get started. You're going to feel free to read the license agreement. At this point, you just want to give it a particular username. In our case, I'm going to do Wired Brain Coffee, and let's do the same thing here. Wired Brain Coffee. Whoops. I'm going to leave the serial number or license key here out. We're going to use the 60-day evaluation. If you had a license key, you can input it during the installation, or you can input it later on when the Virtual Center application has been completely installed, and I'll show you where once we're up and running. So I'm going to leave this blank for now. I'm going to click on Next. If you are pointing to a SQL database server or an Oracle database server or an IBM database server that is not running on this machine, that is running somewhere else, then you would want to make sure you click the second option here. You want to make sure you have your system DSNs pre-configured on your Windows so that when you come in here, they show up in the drop-down menu. For the purposes of our demonstration, we're just going to install the SQL Server 2008 R2 Express on this virtual machine for the purpose of our demonstration. So click Next to continue. What system account or service account do you want to make available, or how do you want to use it? I'm going to opt to use the system account. If you didn't want to use the system account, you can uncheck it and put in whatever you wanted here. Fully qualified domain name of this vCenter server, you would have to put in here. Now here's what I'll tell you. If the fully qualified domain name is not registered properly in DNS, as soon as you click on Next, you're going to be prompted, or you're going to see an error that says it is not registered with DNS. So make sure that you have all the proper DNS registrations completed for vCenter before you install it. These are the default paths where vCenter is going to be installed. Feel free to change them if you need to do so. I'm going to leave them at defaults. So we're installing a standalone vCenter server at this point. The nice thing about using the second option here, which allows you to group a group of vCenters in what's known as linked mode. So I was working for a customer, and the customer had 3 data centers, and they're going through a consolidation of data centers and all sorts of stuff. They had a virtual center server in DR, and they had a virtual center server in their primary data center, and another virtual center server in a different country. Now, they don't mind logging into each one of these virtual centers, but if there was a way to kind of keep them separate but manage them centralized, they wanted that. So they didn't know about the linked mode. With linked mode, what you can do is you can link multiple virtual centers so that you're managing them from the same GUI, except they're completely separate. So all you're doing, think of it as like an MMC plugin. You're just adding another plugin into a master window, so to speak, but you're able to manage all of them from the same console so that you don't have to log in 3 times, etc. So it's very useful. If you have multiple vCenters, I would definitely recommend that you go with linked mode. It just makes administration a lot easier for you. For our purposes, we're just going to go with the first option. These are all the default ports. We talked about those in the presentation. Again, unless you have a need to change them, just keep them at default. If there's a need, just make sure you take a note of what you're changing. This is the port for the inventory service. Again, all of these should be defaults. If you feel a need that you need to change, this is the linked mode port, for example. Your service management port, if you need to change those, go ahead. For the most part, they should be your defaults. Depending on what type of an environment you're about to build, you can tweak or configure vCenter to behave differently. So if you're going to do a small environment, less than 100 hosts, then this would be the ideal option to select. If it's a medium environment, you'll see how the memory values here change depending on what type of an environment you're building or you're trying to build. So this will change the JVM and the memory requirements for the web services running in vCenter. When you're done, we're going to click on Next. When you're ready to install vCenter, we're just going to click on Install, and we're going to just allow the wizard to go through the regular install process. And a few vintages later, the installation of vCenter is complete. So we're going to click on Finish here. Now this completes the installation of vCenter. But in order for you to access vCenter, you have to install the vSphere client in order to give you that GUI access into vCenter. Now the frameworks and everything has been installed. So out of the auto run wizard here, I'm going to select vCenter. I'm also going to go ahead and run through the installation real quick here. There's really nothing exciting to see about the installation of the vSphere client, but I need that in order to be able to log into vCenter, show you the licensing, and show you where the database calculator is at. default installation directory, and install. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the wizard. And once it's done, we're going to click on Finish. We're going to double click on this client here. Because vCenter is installed locally on this machine where I've installed the vCenter client, I have the ability to just say, I want you to point to localhost, and I want you to use the credentials that I used to log into this actual server with, pass them through to Virtual Center. When you have all that, when you have all the relevant information, if you're connecting from a machine, or if you have the vSphere client installed on your laptop or your desktop, then you would have to point to the fully qualified domain name of your Virtual Center server or your IP address, put in your Active Directory credentials here, and you can click on Login to connect. We're going to ignore the SSL certificate that comes with Virtual Center. It's just a standard self-signed certificate that I don't care about at this point. I'm going to click on Ignore. This is just a message that says you have 60 days to evaluate Virtual Center. I understand that. We're going to click on OK. I'm going to go ahead and expand this a little bit. Now think of vSphere Client as your gateway, your eyes into Virtual Center. This is what gives you access to manipulate a Virtual Center. Now to do that, the home screen here is sort of like your launch pad into how you can get in and get quick access to different things. The two things that I want to focus on right now is I was talking to you about licensing. So after the fact, if you haven't installed licenses on your Virtual Center, this is where you can come in, you can click on Manage vSphere Licenses, add in all the relevant licensing information. If you wanted to take care of your database to see how much database size you need, for example, you can come in here where it says vCenter server settings. If you go in there, and you'll notice that on the left here you have your database node, which would tell you how many database connections you can have to your particular database. You can have configure the database retention policy, etc., etc. What you want to do is come up here to where it says statistics, and then down here is where you can configure what type of farm are you trying to build. So right now, if you have 50 physical hosts, 50 physical ESXi hosts in your environment, and you're gonna serve up to 2,000 virtual machines, then the size of the database that you're looking at is 14.32 gig. Now let's bring this in a little more realistic. So let's say we wanted to do, you know what, my farm is going to have 20 ESXi hosts, and you know what, I don't think I'm gonna go over 250 virtual machines. You know what, for giggles, let's keep it at 500 virtual machines on 20 ESX hosts. The total size that I would need for my database is about 3.89 gig. So you can go out and allocate that, or you can tell your database administrator, say, you know what, I'm going to need about 5 gig just to be on the safe side here, estimated space for your database. So this gives you a quick and easy way of estimating what you need from a storage perspective as far as your databases are concerned. I'm going to go ahead and click on cancel, and that's really all there is to it from a vCenter installation perspective. What I'm going to do now is switch back to our presentation. Alright, so let's recap what we learned in this lesson. We started off by talking about what is vCenter Server. We mentioned that vCenter Server is a centralized enterprise class application that allows you to manage your ESXi hosts and your virtual machines. That's in its very, very plain vanilla explanation or definition of vCenter. vCenter is also a framework for VMware and its ecosystem to develop applications that enhance vCenter. Things like DRS and vMotion and Update Manager and Converter and so on and so forth. Those are VMware plugins that enhance vCenter, the orchestrator, etc. However, there are third-party partners that also write applications that also enhance the capabilities of vCenter. So it's this framework that allows everyone to plug in and extend features and capabilities. We talked about the vCenter Server blueprints. What is it made up of? What are the core services? What are the distributed services? What are the plugins? What are the database integration points? What is the Active Directory? What is the vSphere APIs? All of those you need to know for the exam, but also for your own knowledge. We had a quick debate here on whether or not to have vCenter Server as a physical or virtual machine, and one of the main things that I want you to take away out of this is if you're going to do virtual, Make sure you set an affinity rule so that vCenter, you can locate vCenter easily across a couple of identified hosts. You have to identify a few hosts, make sure they're part of the rule so that in the event that you have an issue, you always know that vCenter is on one of the hosts that are part of the rule. So that's one thing I want you guys to definitely take away. vCenter server features, I showed you the diagram of how things tie in together, the access control, the update manager, etc., etc. Just a graphical representation of how things tie together. We talked about the hardware and software requirements needed to install vCenter. We talked about the database requirements that are also needed to install the database for vCenter. We talked about the ports. For the most part, they're all default port requirements. If you decide to change any of these ports, make sure you make a note of it so that when you're installing vCenter, you're making the proper changes, but also any firewalls or anything in the environment that would need to be modified to take advantage of the port changes you've made. Finally, we discussed how to evaluate vCenter 5 from your perspective. If you want to download the ISO, install it, and follow along with us on screen where you would go to do that, and then we went through the installation of vCenter. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.